It is 2021. We live in a completely digital age, and some guy named Christian Mollica, aka VespulaFPV, wrote a book about FPV. It is called FPV Flight Dynamics, and while you might be thinking the same thing that I did as soon as he sent it to me, which is, why do we need a book? The more that I've looked into it, the more that I understand that this is very, very necessary for our hobby. You'll get to hear a little bit about it in the episode. A couple housekeeping notes. If you like what I do here, it really does help the channel if you like, subscribe, and comment. That helps YouTube distribute it more broadly. More people listening means the channel just does better. If you would like to have a podcast version of this episode, there is also a podcast version. You can just search for the Michael Rollins Show on any of your favorite podcast apps. You will see it. However, you don't get this podcast today. You get it a week from now. That's because I have a Patreon. My patrons get the podcast a week in advance. And sometimes, like tonight, they're going to get it early. So if you like what I do and you want to be able to, instead of listening on YouTube, you want to be able to listen to it as a podcast, then go, and you want to listen to it as soon as you can, go sign up for my Patreon. The $1 tier gets you the early podcast. If you really like what I do, then you can add more. I would, as always, like to thank my patrons. They're pretty awesome, and they are one of the reasons that I can keep doing this thing that I love. Christian wrote this book, and honestly, I really was flummoxed. At first, I was kind of curious why he would even attempt it. He sent us, meaning my family and I, 2 copies. One was to me and one was to my kids. And it was my son, Logan, that really opened my eyes to how awesome this thing is. Logan's praise was this: Dad, if I had had this book and a couple different Bardwell videos, I could have gotten off the ground faster. I can't think of a more compelling praise from a 13-year-old boy. Anyways, I hope that you guys enjoy it. I'll talk to you soon. Bye. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Michael Rollins Show, and I am here today with Christian Mollica. How you doing, buddy?
I'm good, Mike. How are you, man?
I am doing okay. All right, so listen. In the time of the internet, where we have YouTube, there is a guy out there who was crazy enough to write a book about FPV, and that is this man right here.
That would be me.
Yes. So this is the book, FPV Flight Dynamics, and he sent me a copy, and he actually sent my kids a copy, which is fantastic. And I got to admit, the part I enjoyed his, which is, for Mr. Michael Rollins, thanks for all the great content. Your friend in FPV, Christian. And then he's got this killer signature right here, because I wish I had a good signature like that. But the one he gave to my kids, to Cole and Logan, was basically told them that I'm the David Letterman of FPV. And I was like, that's awesome. No. And then they looked at me and said, who's David Letterman?
I was going to ask you, because while I was sitting there writing that, I was like, what are the odds that these kids even know who David Letterman is?
No
and I'm like,
clue.
Of course they know who David Letterman is. And
nope.
Sure enough. Am I really dating myself that much?
Dude, he has not
David
been
Letterman?
He's not been on TV for 20 years.
You know what? That's true too. That's
20
true.
years. I mean, it's crazy to think about. Like, I remember growing up with that dude and sitting up super late to just watch him, because it was such a treat.
Like while they're still smoking in the studio.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That long ago.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So Christian has written this book, right? And I remember when I heard about it, I think you had reached out to me, and I had kind of heard a few other things about it. And I was like, why on earth would you write a book about FPV? Because really, honestly, I mean, we have Bardwell, right? Like, if you want to learn how to fly, then you could just go consume all of Bardwell's content. And then I got to thinking about it, and I was like, no, you gotta, first off, consuming all of Bardwell's content would take years at this point. Like, Homeboy is prolific. He has put out a daily video for years now.
His library's up to like 1,500 videos, I think.
Yeah, which is bonkers.
Insane the amount of content.
Yeah, and it's not like he puts out like fluff. I mean, his stuff is dense.
Right.
And the more that I thought about it, I'm like, a lot of times if like when I'm editing, right? A lot of times if I want to go find something, like how do I mask out this object in a video such that it moves, right? I get really frustrated with YouTube videos that tell me how to do that. I just want them to write it out. And the more that I thought about it, I was like, there actually there's a real place here if it's done well. And so, you sent us the books, and my son Logan, he's the best pilot in the house. Don't tell him that. He read through it in like this, and he literally, we opened the books. We talked about it. He asked me who David Letterman was, and then he just disappeared. And he comes back down hours later. He's like, "Dad, this is good. This is real good." And I was like, "Really?" And not that I was surprised, but he was so excited. Ran up to his room, read like 3 or 4 chapters in one sitting, and came downstairs to tell me it was good. And I was like,
how old is he again?
He's 13.
See, that makes me feel good to know that I was able to get a 13-year-old kid to run upstairs and be excited about cracking a textbook.
A 13-year-old kid went upstairs to his room. And by the way, it wasn't just that night. For like a week and a half, I'd be like, "Where's Logan?" And my wife would be, "He's upstairs." And I'd go like peek into his room and be like, "What you doing?" And he's like, "I'm reading the book." So I think he read through all of it or most of it. And, we were chatting about it, and I of course read through some of it, but I'm like a 43-year-old dad with a full-time job, and like I just don't have time to sit down and read like a book the way that it deserves for this interview. And so Logan, I was talking to him. I was like, "So what did you think?" And we walked through and talked about a bunch of stuff, and I said, "So if you had to like conceptualize it, if you had to give like one statement about it, what would you give?" He said, "Dad, if I had had this book and a couple Bardwell videos, I would have been off the ground so much faster."
Yeah.
And I stopped him. I was like, "Okay, so like you're talking like a few pieces of this book in all of Bardwell's videos." He's like, "No, Dad. Like if I had had like a couple videos about actually working inside Betaflight and this book, I'd be done." He said, "I would have been off the ground so much faster." And I was like, wow. That's honestly extraordinarily high praise, especially for
that's one of the best compliments I've heard so far.
Yeah.
I love that.
And he was even, and I said, "Well, okay, well, what doesn't he touch on that he could have?" And Logan goes, "Well, he doesn't really touch too much on soldering, right?" And he goes, "But that doesn't make sense here." He's like, it's not a soldering book. It's an FPV book. So you can go learn how to solder if you want to do this, right? But he said the specialty knowledge it's in the book.
Yeah.
We'll show it again because it deserves to be shown.
Thank you.
So, I mean, so first off, I was impressed to begin with, and then for my 13-year-old son to tell me what he did and tell me all the things he learned and also tell me how funny it was. I can't tell you the number of times he's been like the chart that you have where it's like the Mavic, the DJI drone versus
at the beginning,
He's like literally he's pulled it out and showed it to me like 5 times. He's like, "Dad, you got to see this one." I'm like, "Oh yeah, oh, I have seen that one."
That one actually, to be honest with you, went through a couple of iterations in the first. You should have seen some of the stuff I was writing in the first ones, and I was like, this might be a little too edgy for this. I got to start pulling some of this stuff out, make it a little more PG.
Yeah, his favorite one is like safety features.
Yeah, and it's just the emoji. With
it's just the emoji
laughing.
So
they don't exist.
Yeah, no, not at all. So I mean, how does one sit down and think, "I'm gonna write a book about FPV"? Like, what is the thought process to get into that?
Oh God, I don't know. It wasn't. I was in a white collar corporate job for many, many years before this. And basically, long story short, I just wasn't too happy with what I was doing anymore. And I decided I could do something else. I know that I'm, capable of more, and I would probably just be a whole lot more fulfilled and happier doing something else. I didn't know exactly what that was, but at the time I wanted to just try and turn my hobby into a career. So excuse me, actually what I wanted to do was to create a company that was going to be called Vespula. So I actually did spend quite a bit of time and resources in developing an entire sort of brand and business concepts surrounding that. I won't get into too much detail on that, but anyway, it's basically sort of like a hardware startup to sell FPV components in sort of a different way. Actually, the drone that you see on the cover here, this is actually a full-scale, totally original 245 millimeter freestyle frame that I had modeled myself in Autodesk Fusion 360. So this is just a 3D printed version of it. But anyway, it's legit, and this is the the hero asset, so to speak, that I use throughout the entire book. So anyway, I was trying to do that, and ultimately, long story long, it wasn't going to work out. It was just going to take too much money, and it was just way outside of my realm to do. So actually, in the process of creating, what the ultimate product was going to be, it was supposed to be like the Alienware of FPV, right? So there was going to be build kits where you could sort of pick and choose your own components. And so then included in that, there was going to be sort of like a supplemental manual that it was going to include. And it was just going to be something that would have cool artwork in it, teach you about some tricks and stuff. So actually, I was really inspired by the old school Super Mario 64 manual. And really a lot of the artwork in the book was heavily inspired by specifically this manual. Because I mean, if you look at it, it's just so damn brilliant. You got Mario, and it shows him in different stages, and he's
you can jump off walls.
Yeah, you can do wall kicks in there.
Right.
It was brilliant. But anyway, it was just like this very perfectly captured essence of like input, output. When I do this, Mario does that. And I was like, I want to have that same kind of thing for the book. But anyway, so back to what, the Vespula company was all about. I wanted to add sort of that manual that I was talking about that was going to come into the kit. So actually I wound up making a full-fledged version of it, which this is almost like a Cliff Notes version of the book. I had a bunch of these printed up, and they actually just landed in all of the major FPV retailers. So the stuff is starting to go out with everybody's kind of like as a viral marketing campaign, I guess you could say. But anyway, Vespula itself wasn't going to work. So I already had materials in, a smaller manual type thing like I just showed you. And ultimately I decided, I'm going to pivot and just sort of take what I've already got and flesh it out into a full book. And it took about 3 times longer than I thought that it would actually take. But, at some point I was so deep into it. It was like, I can't quit now. So I just kept going. And honestly, it was just like an ongoing joke between, my friends and my family. Like, hey, Christian, that book you're working on, when's that going to be done? And I was like, 2 weeks. Yeah. Definitely in 2 weeks.
You and Trappy, 2 weeks.
Yeah. And I said that for basically 8 months straight. And then eventually it was done.
It's dense. Like, it's big. I mean, even with all of the, it's 279 pages.
Yeah.
Even with all of the graphics and whatnot, which, by the way, the graphics really are nice. I mean, here's one on how to do corkscrew gates. So, I mean, here, let's see if I can get that up there. Like, I just opened it up. This just caught my attention. And, I mean, it's actually kind of somewhat obvious what you're supposed to do here.
That's what I hope. I hope that when you look at these, you're like, oh, yeah, that's very obvious. But trust me, it was anything but obvious to me while I was
God, I can only imagine. I will tell you this, like, for me, doing something like that, I would have really struggled with the 3-dimensional space aspect of it.
Yeah.
But so I guess what is that process like? You know, like you decide well, it sounds like you pivoted, which is what all good startups do.
Yeah.
And at what point did it seem obvious that the book was it? And at what point did you realize you were committed? Like, was there a commitment beforehand, or did you just start into it and then realize, I've gone down this far enough, I should keep going?
Tough to say. I mean, by the time I got about, I don't know, 3 or 4 months into it, I realized like there's just no turning back. I have to finish it. And at some point it just really became a driving obsession, really. And then also you have to understand this is pretty much right when Corona started. So, I mean, at that point, I had left my previous position. I was kind of just living off of my savings at that point. I didn't really have an option to go back to a normal job anyway. I wasn't going to be hired anywhere. I used to do, like white collar sales work, live person to person sales. I wasn't going to be able to get another job. So I was in it. I was like, all right, well, this is what's happening. I might as well just finish this and get it out. So that's kind of just how it went. I mean, like I joke around and say, basically, I just kept stumbling forward until eventually I created the book, and then there it is,
Yeah, but there's actually like a real metaphor for life in there. It's like, well, I haven't stopped, so I might as well just keep going.
Just keep going,
Did you ever like sit down and think to yourself, like, oh my God, why am I writing a book? Like, there's so much online. Did that thought process go through your head at all, or very much, or?
No, I'll tell you this. Yeah, well, yes and no. Well, first of all, writing the book was, to be perfectly honest with you, a very lonely experience that was fraught with a lot of self-doubt. And, it took a lot to kind of keep waking up every day and going to do this alone. Because, again, it's not a 9-to-5 job. You don't have a team of people that you can talk to. I didn't, work with anyone else. Everything in here, I wrote everything, edited everything, illustrated everything. I formatted the entire thing for print, published it. Like, everything is completely my work, and I had no one else to really bounce ideas off of. So, exactly like you're saying, to do that for an entire year straight with absolutely no guarantee that it's going to become something was really quite difficult. I would love to say that I look back on that creative process and it was this beautiful journey, and I loved it and everything, but it actually, it really sucked, and I'm glad that it's done and it's over with. But on the flip side of that, that's one of the comments, honestly, that I've heard quite often, that, why would I bother reading a book when I can just get everything that I want online? And I think there's two aspects of that comment in particular that irk me a little bit. I think one of them is the insinuation that the book and everything within it is nothing more than this, plagiarized amalgamation of stuff that I ripped from other pilots' content online, which is anything but the case, because everything within it is.
I think if you spend 10 minutes in the book, you will realize that is not the case.
Yeah,
it's not like you just sat there, like the sheer insinuation. Like, if anybody has sat there and said that you plagiarized this thing, I would be offended for you, right?
What bugs me the most about that is that it's almost like, I feel like if anyone were to do that, it would just be really lazy and morally bankrupt. And I would never be the kind of person to be okay with putting my name on something like that and then trying to charge people money for it, But then also, I think the insinuation that you can get everything you want online is just patently incorrect. I think that there's so many topics that are currently not, widely discussed in the FPV community, and they don't have any sort of universally recognized terminology that's associated with it. I mean, so much so that I was able to come up with 300 pages of pretty much original material to put into a book. So this notion that FPV, like, every stone has been upturned, every dark corner has had a light shown upon it, is, in my mind, is just a little absurd. Like, there's so many things. I mean, even from the most basic, like, for example, one of the things I talk about in the book is the baseline position, which is essentially sort of like the mini quad equivalent, acro equivalent to what they call in manned aviation SLF, or straight and level flight. So basically the quadcopter's moving downrange in a straight line at a constant speed, heading elevation. But what's important about it is that its attitude is equal to the up tilt of its FPV camera. Now, this is a super intuitive concept that I know you know what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. Everybody who's listening to this knows exactly what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. But it's one of the most fundamental concepts associated with acro flying, and yet we don't even have a word for that. Yeah. And I think that we should. And that's just one small part of it. There's so many other things that I had gone into great detail in the book.
So one of the things that I have found, and I feel like this is probably rampant to a degree, and I don't use rampant as like a derogatory statement, just in the sense that this probably springs up everywhere and not many people are aware of how much it springs up. And I can tell you one of the moments it became super aware to me that I did something that I thought was normal that people do not do. And when I finally figured out that what I had been doing is not what everybody else did, but everybody else did this other thing, it greatly improved my flying. So in almost all of my flight videos, you will notice as I come down, I bounce, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I had always tried to figure out why that was. I didn't know why I bounced, and I always looked at it and thought, I don't like that. And I didn't like it because I didn't see anybody else doing it, right? But there wasn't a understanding of why I did it versus why I didn't see it in other people's videos. Right. And so then recently, this was relatively recently, Steele, did a one of his one pack, crazy flights, but he threw a 4S battery on a 6S. And partway through, he makes all the sounds that Steele makes as he's like surprised, and he starts talking about how there's not as much power as he thinks there is he wants. And then he says something really interesting. He said, I mean, you can pitch back and throttle up to recover from he was like coming down. You can pitch back and throttle up to recover, but most people don't do that and don't know how to do that. And I'm like, but that's how I stop myself in dives, man. What do you mean most people don't know how to do that? And all of a sudden it was like this aha moment where it was like, people are not pitching back to arrest their motion on a dive. They're throttling up.
Right.
And it was like this. Oh, that's what it was.
Right, right.
But in all of the YouTube video that I have watched in this hobby, no one has talked about the proper throttle position when coming out of a dive.
Right. You know what? I saw, to your point there, I saw another interview that you were doing. I think it was with Nurk, and it was a similar situation. You were talking about how you were out with your son, Logan, and I think you were talking about spatial awareness.
Yeah.
And your son said something to you that was like an epiphany. It was like, when I go past a tree, I think he said that tree sort of still exists behind me in my awareness. And you were like, well, when I go past it, it's just kind of gone and I'm still looking forward.
And specifically, the thing I was talking about here was not necessarily like, I know that this wall is behind me, right?
Right.
And I know that there's light bulbs right here and whatnot. But in my sense of the room, I don't feel it, right?
Right.
And the thing that Logan and I were kind of getting around was, for him, he does feel the wall back there, right? Like there is some kind of construct in his brain that equates into the presence of the wall. And the same thing is true for him when he's flying, where if he goes past a tree, it's, sure, when I go past a tree, I know there's a tree there somewhere, right? But as his drone moves in three-dimensional space, there's still a reference to the presence of that tree, a model, a mental construct, if you will, to let him know where that tree will likely be when he comes back around. And I don't have that, period. I don't. And for him, the flying acro and doing everything like that is a mix of whatever that spatial sense is that I don't have in vision.
Right.
Whereas for me, that spatial sense really isn't there. and it never has been. It's there's reasons for that. So for me, flying is a visual, very, very, very visual thing, as opposed to a visual plus a three-dimensional construct in my head.
Right.
And there's nobody has talked about that.
Exactly. So now for these two examples that you're bringing up, one of them is, okay, so throttle management strategy coming out of a dive on the bottom, and then we're also talking just generally about spatial awareness. So now these are two things that to you as a pilot who's been flying for a while probably just seem to be, these universally self-evident truths to you. Like, this is just how it is. Yep. This is how I've always done it. And I don't think to question it. And it's not until someone else just sort of says something off the cuff about that thing where you have that paradigm shifting realization where you're like, oh, wait, there's a whole other way to do this. Other people think about this in a different way. I think it's not until, we really take the time to sort of question those things. It's that kind of thing where we can both go outside, look up at the sky and agree, okay, the sky is blue, right? But is my blue your blue? And it's one of those, seemingly innocuous details where it's like, should we be talking about this? Who cares? The sky's blue, right? But then when you start to realize all the nuance that's in there, all the different, shades of gray that exist in between. So that was kind of, one of the goals that I really wanted to accomplish with the book. I wanted to be able to sort of inject some new vocabulary into the community and to raise some topics that would give, pilots basically something to latch onto and then to have a conversation around. And I've said this before, like, listen, my book is not, I've heard other people call it the FPV Bible. I will tell you it's not. Nothing that I write in there is FPV gospel. These are basically, just my ideas on a lot of topics. I wanted to present them to people in the community in a thought-provoking way, sort of lift up a concept, show it to people and rotate it, look at it from different angles, but then ultimately sort of put it back onto the reader to sort of decide what they think about it and how they want to incorporate it into their flying.
So I will tell you why that's so important. And I do believe it's important. And to get there, we're going to take a little bit of a circuitous route. So my background is not only computer science, but also biology, right? So I think I can officially call myself a scientist, which is what I always wanted to be as a kid. So it makes me excited. And going back to your idea on the sky is blue, but which color blue?
Right.
What it turns out is that the gene that codes for the blue color is in fact it actually, when that gene is expressed, it builds a protein. That protein, which is part of how your visual system grabs onto a photon that is a specific shade of blue. Okay. And the wild thing is that your shade of blue that you grab onto is probably a little bit different than mine because the structure of our proteins is likely slightly different. There's an interesting concept that comes up, and we're getting super nerdy, but I have a reason for it. There's an interesting construct that comes up called tetrachromy. So you and I have a blue gene, a red gene, and a green gene. This is assuming that neither one of us is red, blue colorblind.
Right.
The blue, what is that? The blue travels on the X chromosome, I think is what it is. So what that ends up meaning is that it is possible for a woman to have two different genes for the color blue. So our visual color space is 3 points, right? We've got the red, we've got the blue, we've got the green. Okay.
Right.
There are women whose color space is actually 4 points. And that therefore gives them like not just a better color definition, it gives them a color definition that no other person on the planet can match. Right? They can see shades and name shades that other people can't see. Okay, so how does that relate to this book? we are talking about some pretty wild ideas in perception here, right? How do I prove that the shade of blue that I see is possibly different from the shade of blue that you see? Or how do I prove that even though you, me, and everybody in my city sees one shade of blue, that there's not a city out there where they see a slightly different shade of blue? Right. In order to talk about that concept of perception, we actually have to break it down into a lexicon, a framework and a lexicon that gives us the ability to express these ideas in a way that's totally abstract from perception. And so, in biology, that's genes, that is genetics, that is how does the human DNA actually do something, right? That is the lexicon in a sense, and the underlying framework for biology. This is probably the first condensed attempt at building that lexicon and that underlying framework that I think I've seen. And it's, not that bits and pieces aren't out there, right? Like, we all have pretty much, like, a power loop is a power loop. If you fly FPV, you know what a power loop is, right? But not a lot of people know what a trippy spin is, or, you know what a Matty is, right? Like, we have a lexicon that we work with, but it's pretty basic, right? Like, I mean, if you think about it, we do borrow terminology from, like, split S, right? Well, split S, that exists in the fixed wing flight world, but we don't really do a split S. I don't even know how. I've heard people say that, like, we don't do split S's. But talking about this whole concept of forward flight, that's on the straight line, that's moving at a specific velocity and a specific height,
right?
To not even have a word for that, like, that's interesting. I've never thought of it that way. And so I think that besides all the ideas that this is condensed, that I can go ahead and get in here, grab a concept and get out, you've probably just laid a foundation for a continued discussion on the specifics of perception of flight, because you've defined them.
And yeah, I mean, that was ultimately the end goal in a lot of ways too, was to establish, like I said, a broader vocabulary that we could use, a more robust lexicon of communication, because there is a lot of, nuance that's kind of lurking beneath the surface that I think we haven't really been able to uncover yet. And to your point on some of the specific maneuvers too, like, a power loop is a power loop, right? Well, I'd say actually maybe not so much. If you've later on when you get off, if you want to flip through chapter 22, I talk about the core four maneuvers. So it's power loop, barrel roll, aileron roll, and split S. These are what I consider to be the four core maneuvers. And within that chapter, it's one of the longest chapters in the book. I actually break down many different ways to kind of skin the same cat. So like, a power loop is a power loop, but is it? It depends on, how you're actually exiting the loop. I talk about how there's parachuting power loops, or you can execute a textbook power loop by, initiating what they call a pullback dive from the crest of the loop all the way through the trough. And then with the split S maneuver, for instance, yeah, exactly. There you go. So that's what the textbook power loop would be. Yep. If we're arguing semantics and you wanted to do what's considered to be a textbook power loop from, classic fixed wing aerobatic standards, then that's what it would look like. But in FPV, because we're not flying a fixed wing and we're not bound to the same laws of physics that an airplane is, we can actually just sort of, chop throttle, throw the quad backwards, and now, at the crest of the maneuver, we can actually just sort of click back on pitch to look down, and now we're sort of looking at the object while we're floating backwards and looking at it. Now, that's a very different way to execute a power loop than if you were to just continue to, pull back or pull back while throttling up to just sort of continue going, right? And it's the same thing with the split S maneuver, for instance. Classic split S, you execute a 180-degree aileron roll, you invert the quad over the top of the object, and then you just pull back and dive out. But in FPV, that's not really what we do. We kind of just throw the quad, we huck it up, and just sort of vault over the top of it while kind of like looking at the object as we float over the top, and then sort of parachute down the back. That's a very different way to execute the same general maneuver, but we don't have a word for that, And again, that was just sort of my attempt to call out these things and to make people think a little more deeply about what it is that we're actually doing. And it was an interesting experience too while I was going through this, because I was like, what the hell am I supposed to call this stuff? Like, they don't have words.
Right.
You know, when you think about it, there's really only like a handful of things. Like, I could say juicy flick, like, you know what a juicy flick is, you know what a Rubik's Cube is, you know what a Matty flip is. But then there's like a huge gray area when we're talking about, you know, just flicks in general, or a look back trick. Like, what is a look back? Right. There's so many variations to these things. So I just wanted to call attention to it and say, like, hey, there's a lot of ways to do these things. I think we should be talking about it. And well, here's some terminology that you can use. Hopefully it sparks a conversation with your buddy.
Well, and even to that, like, you know, you think about, okay, well, power loop, that's Stingy's thing. Stinger Swarm, you know, really, you know, built those, and he was the power loop king, right? Yep. And or is, my apologies, he's still alive as far as I know. But then you find out, and this happened to me, that the way that I do a power loop is different than his, and I can tell because when I start watching his videos and I hear his power loop, they sound different than mine.
Really? What? Yeah. With the revving up of the motors, is at different points?
So yeah, he from some of the things, and this is off memory from a while ago, but he is much more on the throttle than I am through the inverted part of the power loop.
Right.
And so he has, you know, like you were saying, like, I just kind of like pitch back and throttle and sort of throw it backwards through the air in this giant maneuver. And then as I'm floating, I continue to, you know, pitch around so that I can see the object I'm trying to get over. His is very different. And the fact that he flies at a 45-degree camera angle and the fact that I fly at like a 30-degree camera angle means that we're also executing it differently, even if everything else is the same, because my camera angle affects how I do it.
Right. Yeah, that's a big difference.
Yeah.
Relative to exactly what you're seeing and what you're filming through that maneuver versus what the actual quadcopter's orientation is while it's moving through that, there's a huge difference between 30 and 45.
Yeah.
Camera angle theory is a big aspect of FPV, which I went into in a lot of detail. In this.
Who's the you know, Maddie did this, but then there was the guy in, was it I don't know if it's Florian Leprol. I know he's got a lot going on in the graphics side.
Florent Roque, maybe.
He flew with like almost a backwards camera angle. Yeah. Right? And some of the maneuvers he was able to pull off made you think that he was doing things that should not be possible. With a drone. And so go ahead.
Okay, so I think I know the guy that you're talking about. Him and Maddie.
Sure he's French.
I believe he's French too. Maddie and Drew, I believe, a couple years ago on an episode of Rotor Riot, they were critiquing, I think, freestyle videos. Yep, right? He was one of them. Mm-hmm. Okay, and he was doing all of that, you know, crazy inverted stuff. He was doing
through the trees. Yeah.
Yeah, he was doing Maddie type stuff basically, which is like super high camera up tilt. Okay, so here I'll tell you what, to bring that and that other concept I was talking about earlier, something as super basic as the baseline position, like why it's actually important to call something out like that, okay? Because it sort of forms the basis of understanding camera angle theory, right? And this goes a lot farther than just like, okay, you know, LOL racers fly with high up tilt because must go forward fast, right? We can start talking about now how the baseline position affects different aspects of FPV freestyle, for instance. Okay, so let's talk about the low end right now. So why do, you know, pilots who are practitioners of the, you know, the juicy genre of FPV freestyle, why do they tend to fly with camera angles that are in the lower 15 to 20 to 25 degree camera angle? And the reason for that is because it offers them a more neutral platform from which they can basically just flick their quad in any direction and instantaneously manipulate their momentum. And this is what gives that juicy pilot the ability to capture that sort of bouncing off the walls. It looks like a pinball bouncing through the environment type effect. This is something that you would not be able to get at higher camera angles, right? So now if you take on the other end of that spectrum and you want to look at guys like Maddie and Florent Roque, for them to be able to pull off these really crazy inverted maneuvers, they're flying with extreme camera up tilt at like 60 to 65 degrees. Now, what does this actually let them do? It allows them to invert the camera's vantage while still holding the quadcopter in a positive upright attitude. Okay, so what from your perspective on the screen, from the first person perspective, looks like they're upside down. The camera's vantage has flipped over, but the quadcopter is in fact still in a positive upright attitude. All that they're really doing is essentially looking up at the thing.
Looking back, yeah.
And they're going around. Okay, so for instance, while you're performing a trippy spin or a cyclone or an inverted orbit, as I documented it in the book, basically you would think, okay, well, it's going around. If this is like a smokestack or something, okay, the quad is going around like this. But obviously that can't be possible because you'd have negative thrust and you'd be going down. So now with that higher camera angle, what it looks like is actually something like this. So with that higher camera up tilt, because it's so high, you can actually invert the camera's vantage while looking back at it. And now this is what it looks like. It's going around like this. So this is how you can, keep the quadcopter upright and aloft, maintain positive thrust while looking like you're upside down. So now this is a really, really advanced concept that we're talking about in acro flying. We're talking about like inverted trippy spins, right? Yeah. But this is a conversation that we would not be able to have if we couldn't sort of come to the basic understanding of like, okay, this is baseline position, right? We have to sort of establish those fundamentals before we can then start talking about like, well, why does a trippy spin work?
So we need the lexicon.
That's
right. Yeah, it is super interesting because so first off, when I think about the guy Maddie and Florent, when they fly like that, I don't even know that I could, right? Because my frame of reference doesn't allow for it. Period.
Right.
I suspect that you need a lot of that three-dimensional feeling that we've already established I don't have. And at the same time, now I can fly the low camera tilt, which is my son actually flies like 20 degrees and I fly like 30. Mm-hmm. But I've never thought about the fact that his tricks are different because his camera angle's lower. I mean, sitting here,
right.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The tricks are actually, I mean, when you think about it, depending upon what he's doing, because of the camera up tilt, it actually makes it easier to do some of those things. You have to sort of think about what's the quad actually doing. In a lot of cases, it looks, like you're just going right up against a wall or something, when in fact you're sort of just coming up to it and just punching out.
Yeah.
It's all about just perspective, really. Mm-hmm. And then really, the screwy thing about when you're flying at uber high up tilt is that you're sort of flipping the relative meaning of the roll and the yaw command. So the relative proportion, the proportional influence of each one of those commands to get the quad to perform, coordinated spins and turns, flips after 45 degrees.
Yeah.
So that's another thing that you got to kind of keep in the back of your head. On top of that, while you're flying in the baseline position, if you have a 65-degree camera tilt, like the quad is basically like this while it's moving forward. So you have to fly at extremely high throttle positions just to maintain enough, lift just to keep the quad up. So yeah, there's a lot of things to that are technically pretty difficult to get your head around.
Yeah, no, and yeah, it is true. Yeah. Where did your frame of reference come for all this? Like, how much time have you thought about flying? Not necessarily with the intent of doing anything, but like thinking about flying.
A lot. I mean, I don't know. That's just how my brain works, to be honest with you. Whenever I get into a hobby, I always just get way into it, and it's just sort of something that becomes an obsession. FPV is the one hobby that I, in my lifetime have really stuck with. And now I'm reaping, the rewards of it, because I've actually gotten to what I would consider to be a high level in it. But I don't know.
You and I did have a conversation about flow, and I feel like you gave me the best definition for flow that anybody has ever given me. Do you remember what that was, or that you told me?
Was it the abridged definition of flow, or I can wax poetic on this?
It was the when your skill matches your desire. It's basically when your skill matches your intent, I think is the way that you framed it.
Right. So well, this was a concept that I documented earlier in the book. I called it the FPV feedback loop. So it's breaking down essentially the FPV experience into 3 distinct phases where you have input, output, and then feedback. So when we're talking about input is basically in my head, okay, I'm thinking about what I want to do, and then I need to, take that idea and then translate it, into a stick input. This is my input. That input then gets sent to the flight controller. It's going to, orchestrate the quadcopter's physical response in midair. And then ultimately the visual vantage of the camera is going to be sent back into my goggles. I'm going to receive feedback, right? So I get feedback of what my input was. Now, obviously this is occurring, whatever you want to say, thousands of times per second. When you're first starting out, you can think of the time between the issuance of an input and the feedback that you receive in the goggles as latency, right? So beginner pilots fly with extreme latency for tons of reasons because they just really can't coordinate their hands. They don't know how the quadcopter flies. They don't know how to use, the feedback that they're receiving. So a lot of the times what happens for the beginner is that, they're going downrange, they move the stick, and then all of a sudden, like the screen moves in a certain way, and they're like, what just happened? They don't understand, right? So they're still stuck like mentally 50 feet in the back. Versus when you get to sort of the advanced and master levels, you're not only flying at 0 latency, but you're actually sort of getting out ahead of the feedback loop, right? So now what you're doing is you're looking at the screen, you're plotting out targets in advance, you're looking at where you want to go, and you're just formulating the appropriate inputs based on those intentions, and you're just executing. And that's really what flow is. It's decisive intent combined with the ability to execute in FPV. I wrote a whole chapter on that. Chapter 2 was basically all about flow and sort of the progression of the pilot. You're a musician, aren't you?
I am.
Do you play? You are. So I make tons of, this is obviously nothing original, but I make tons of allusions to flying FPV, to, making music, like a visual form of music. One of the examples that I use to open up the book in the introduction is I'm talking about, how I picked up the electric guitar for the first time when I was a teenager. And I had, my guitar hero was Joe Satriani. I remember listening
Surfing with the alien, baby.
Yeah, man, he is one of the best. Absolute master.
I can hear it right now.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And so I remember listening to one of his songs one day, and like suddenly I just had this epiphany in my head that like Joe doesn't just make music. Joe actually is the music, right? The sounds that I'm hearing coming out of those speakers are essentially originating within his mind, but then they just flow effortlessly through his hands and then out into the world, right? So in that respect, the guitar merely is the medium through which he's taking that sound out of his head and then putting it into the heads of his audience. So essentially the musician is saying to their audience that I want you to hear what I hear in here. And the FPV pilot is saying, I want you to see what I see. So they're just using the quadcopter as an instrument to sort of project that visual manifestation of their thoughts onto the screen. And then the beauty of that is that they're able to record that experience and share it with other people. That's the beauty of FPV.
So the interesting thing, like carrying that a little bit further, as Joe's sitting there playing, like you hear this melody. Like there's a melody that continues that he comes back to, right? That in a sense could, and people get really, like that is the key piece of the music, right? That is somewhat analogous to our choosing of lines in a sense.
Right.
Where it's like, okay, well, the structure upon which I'm determining this flight is this set of lines that I'm taking. It's funny though, like in the conversation that we had, this was over like Messenger. one of the things you reminded me of was when I first started flying, and probably for like the first year, because I started flying in like 2016 when there really weren't simulators, and in order to learn how to fly, you soldered it all together, and then you took it off the ground and you smashed it into 1,000 pieces within like 20 seconds if you were lucky, because normally it was like 5. And I remember talking to my buddy Rob Garland here locally about how much I had to think about my hands.
Right, yeah.
Right, where I would just sit there and think about, okay, I want my stick input to be this way, and okay, now I got to think about, okay, he said cross coordinating is better than just using roll or just using yaw. And there was a solid year, and especially this one particular time, and it's funny because I now fly left far easier than I fly right because of this time. I would just pick up my quad and I'd go sit on my front porch and I'd run this lap over and over and over again. Well, it turns out that lap has nothing but left turns in it. So I actually got really, really good at, a specific type of left-hand turn. And I don't even think about it now. And I remember the shock that I had when I realized one day that I had gone out flying. This was not in the yard, this was somewhere else. And I had not thought about my sticks one time.
Yeah.
And it was a truly kind of amazing feeling.
It's very meditative. It's, you got to get into that Zen state of FPV. You're right. You're not thinking about it anymore. When you get to a certain level, your fingers just sort of melt. Mm-hmm. They meld into the sticks, and it's just thought input. It just goes directly. You don't have to think about which way do I push or pull them? How do I do it? It just happens, and everything just flows. You can start to fly on a much more macro level, right? Because while you were a beginner, what you're talking about is flying on a very micro level. You're really micromanaging everything that's going on, and you have to spend a lot of brain resources to think about what you need to do. Now, once you get that down, you have that muscle memory, and you feel connected to the screen. You just know when I just nudge the stick a hair in this direction, you can see the screen move in response, and you just know what's going to happen. That's when flow really, you really get into it. That takes a great deal of mental focus. I think it's kind of like walking on a tightrope where the slightest disturbance is enough to just knock you off of it. And then as you continue to gain experience flying in that flow state, it becomes significantly easier to enter the flow state, and then also much, much easier to maintain it. But not easy when you're a beginner. Definitely not.
Well, and now 3, 4, 5 years in the future, however long it's been, especially since last year was like 100 years.
It feels like it.
It was funny because I was in the front yard, same steps. Well, I actually fly standing, but I wasn't sitting. But I remember I was doing something similar to the same lap. I was just doing it in reverse because sometimes I still try to work on my right hand turns, and because
you're like Derek Zoolander, man.
Yeah, you're not an choo, and then it's like, no, Mike, go right. Yeah, like I actually have to think about going right sometimes. And I at one point I'm flying and I stopped under, it's this magnolia tree, right, that I had flown under 1,000 times. And I sat there and I was like, keep in mind, I'm still flying. It's not like I've put this thing on the ground. As I'm going underneath the tree, I kind of pull up short and I sit there and I look at the tree and I'm like, I wonder if I can go through the very small parts of that tree. And so all of a sudden I'm like creeping up into the tree, into the canopy, and I'm like, popping my throttle and getting in between like a V in the tree that's like this wide,
Right.
And it never, it took me a few times and I finally got it. And then I finally landed the quad and I was like, how did I do that? Yeah, it's like there was not a thought about how to control it. It was just this idea that I wanted it there, and I just put it there.
And you just did it.
And I just did it. There was no overhead thinking on it.
To that point, I will say that one of the odd and unfortunate side effects of getting better at FPV is that it actually does require less and less focus. So there's sometimes now where I'll go out and fly, and all of a sudden, like I'll just come to, and I'll be like, oh shit, I'm diving down the back of an 80-foot tall tree right now, and like I better pay attention because I need to pull out of this thing. And I realized, like, I spent the last 10 seconds just daydreaming, like wondering, like, did I set up like auto pay on my car insurance? And
right.
And that's one of the unfortunate things. Like, I have to actually be mindful and present and force myself to do it. Whereas when I was a beginner, it was like 110% of my focus is on this, and that still wasn't enough. Now it's like, I don't know, I can put like 10% of my brain power on this and fly at a good level. But
so that actually comes around to one of my favorite thoughts, which is the adrenal response. Right? Like the first time you put the goggles on and the first time you throttled up and your eyes were probably this big and your heart was hammering and your palms are sweaty. I mean, that first feeling is probably the most addictive thing about flying.
Oh God, yeah.
I mean, just the sheer intensity and terror and joy of getting off the ground the first time.
Yeah.
And the thing that I have realized, now as I've gone out and I've dived buildings, right? I dove the tallest building in Virginia. As I have gone out and dude, I've been to approximately 399 feet AGL so many times where I could just barely touch the moon. Right. and none of that makes my heart hammer anymore.
Does it not?
It doesn't. And like,
I actually
go ahead.
Well, obviously not to the same extent when I first, but I still get that same rush even when I go out now. It does take a little bit to just kind of calm the nerves. Because I always wonder, like, you go out when you're cold and you just have dumb thumbs and you're like, I don't know, can I fly a mini quad today? Like, do the gods of Quadhala smile favorably upon me? I don't know. Can I fly a quad or can I not? And I still get that same kind of rush.
I do, if I haven't flown for a while, like I haven't flown in a few days right now. And the last time I did fly, I've actually been messing around with these Sub-250 5-inch builds. God, they're so much fun.
That thing looks quick.
Oh my God, dude. Look here. All right. We're going to take a side note here. Okay. So these are Tommy's motors. This is Rugi's frame. Yep. And then actually most of the electronics are something that Rugi recommended on his site. I've got a 4-cell 450 milliamp hour battery.
Yeah.
This whole thing is roughly 200 grams. Okay.
Wow.
That
thing rips.
Is a rocket. And the thing that is that, like, but okay, fast. Like I'll tell you what, if I lay the throttle down on my 5-inch, I'm going to get really fast too. I can stop that thing on a dime.
Yeah.
Like the first time I was like, all right, I want to see how responsive this thing is. And so I did a giant punch out, which by the way, when I was, typically, I mean, I fly like these 700 gram 5-inches nowadays because of, the battery and the GoPro. And so if I hammer the throttle, like, the voltage delivery drops to like, 14 volts, especially because I've got old battery. Yeah. It's like, but it'll get up there. When this thing, like, the voltage barely dipped, I got up about as high as I was comfortable with a newer build, tipped it down and just let it fall. And it fell and fell and fell and fell and fell. And then I let it go a whole lot longer than I would have with my larger 5-inch. And then I just pitched back and blipped the throttle and it stopped.
Yeah.
It wasn't even like it took slowed down. It just stopped. Yeah. And the boys and I were on the front porch, and as soon as I did it, we were like, oh, we're like yelling because this 200 gram drone came down and went boop. So they're fun to fly. You should definitely see if you can make yourself one.
Yeah, I want to experiment with some of the lighter ones.
Oh, there's so much. Like, I am 100% going to be getting a decased GoPro to try to figure out. And it probably won't be this frame. But I really like this frame. This is Bob's, is it the Power Pick? I think. Bob Ruge. It's a fantastic frame. We do obviously need to mount the VTX antenna differently, but
right.
Yeah. So yeah, if I go out and I fly my 5-inch, right, and part of the reason I might still get a little bit is because I do know that I've flown enough to know that not everything is assured. You got to take it careful, and that first flight could end disastrously if you don't know something.
Right. And
so like that first flight, maybe the second flight, like I'm a little anxious. Once we get into the third, fourth, fifth battery, you know, I'm punching out over 80-foot oaks that I'll never get it back from.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. If I screw up. And it just doesn't even really faze me anymore. What I have found is that the only way that I can get that same, like, just true heart hammer, 110% focus feeling, is over water.
Oh, really?
So we've got, this area is eat up with salt water. I mean, we have more coastline in this area than anywhere I've ever been, because it's
I saw your trip to Bali.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Right. Y'all need to go check out my Instagram and check out our trip to Bali. It was fantastic. There was one day, so like over last summer, I have an aunt and uncle that live on one of the larger bays here. It's called Lincoln Bay. And I started like flirting with going out over Lincoln Bay, but I'd go out like, 30 feet or 30 yards and bring it back. It was always close enough. If I needed to, I could jump in and get it.
Right.
And then I went further and then further and then further. And at some point I was like, hey, this is kind of cool, but I don't really want to do anything risky here.
Right.
And then one day I put it in the water and I got it back. That was salt water, so there wasn't
in salt water.
In salt water, yeah. But I got the GoPro, I got everything back. The motors technically still worked. The ESC still worked. It was nothing I was gonna fly in a high stress environment.
Right.
But that got me thinking, and so over the summer, my kids started learning how to surf. So before I knew it, I was on the beach at dawn while my kids were surfing, flying half a mile out over the Atlantic, and ended up capturing footage of dolphins and all this other stuff, and losing my body, like not even knowing where to come back in. So
I mean, you couldn't even hear it anymore. So it was
you can't
all
even
visual.
hear it.
I mean,
all visual. The farthest out I ever got, we think it was probably about a half mile. I was probably broadcasting at like 800 milliwatts on Free Sky Tyrannus, not Crossfire,
not even on a Crossfire.
And I think as I recall, I think it was on an XM Plus at that. So
that's how you really get your heart going.
Yeah, the sketch factor is super high.
Range on Free Sky.
Yeah, but at some point I started losing video and turned my body, and all of a sudden my video got solid again, and that's when I was like, probably time to bring it back in.
Yeah.
And but that is also, I was chasing dolphins. Like, I wasn't anywhere near them, but I was close enough I could see them and kind of orbit around them. And when I came back in, I had been standing next to a fence, and there was another fence like a couple hundred yards to my left, and I came in on the other fence thinking it was where I was. I scared the hell out of some poor lady. And but as I put it on the ground or in the ocean or the beach effectively, and unplugged the battery, I was like, all right, I'm done today.
That's enough for one day.
Yes. Have you talked about, and I know I just said a lot of words, But have you like given much thought to what it does take to maintain that adrenal response like that?
I don't know. I'm not sure if it's specifically what it is while I'm flying. Obviously, the more you do it, you just become more accustomed to it. But it's just one of those things. Yeah, I mean, I'm 35 years old now, and I don't, not to sound like a wet blanket, but I mean, the older that you get, it takes more and more to make an impression on you. As the years go by and you have more experience being a human being on the planet Earth, you've seen it all, you've experienced it all. So there's not a whole lot that sort of really jumps out and grabs you and says like, hey, this is different, this is awesome. FPV is still one of those things. The first time I saw it, I was like, I know exactly what this is. I know that I want to do it. I don't care how much it costs or what it's going to take me to do it. I want in, and I did. And ever since then, it's just been this constant love affair with FPV. And even to this day, I still get that experience. Again, I'm 35 years old. When I go out and fly, I can't help but sit there with this like big stupid grin on my face because I'm just so in awe of what it is that I'm doing. And actually, one of the things that I really enjoy now is, I don't know, I wouldn't say like performing for people live, but when I go out to the park, it's an interesting experience, okay? Because I remember when I first started flying years ago, when I would take my drone out, obviously I sucked. And it was very obvious that I sucked. To anyone, whether you knew anything about drones or not, if you were in the park and you were looking at this drone like, yeah, you would be like, I don't know what this guy is doing here, but I don't trust him with that thing and I don't like it, right? Now, you contrast that like 5 years later, if I'm in that same park, what I'm doing with a quad now, people stop dead in their tracks. And this is one of the things that I think as FPV pilots, we kind of forget what it's like to not have any experience or contact with these things, because people have never in their lives seen anything like a mini quad moving through the environment, and they will stop dead in their tracks to just stand there with their mouth down and watch that. They'll hear it from afar. What is that thing that's screaming in the distance? And then all of a sudden they see it. And when I take people out to out to go fly with me, I have an extra set of goggles, and most of the time, like, they wear the goggles for 2 seconds and they're like, no, I'd rather just stand here and like look at it, because they're just so in awe of watching this physical object move through 3-dimensional space like that. And so now I have situations where like I'll be flying. There was a couple months ago before the weather turned, I was out and there was this guy with his dog and his son, and they just like stopped maybe 100 feet from me and they were just watching me fly. And so I bring this thing in for like a nice smooth landing, just drop it down at my feet. And before I even get the goggles off, I hear this guy just like clapping in the background. And so I pick my goggles up. I like gave him
the
a
sun's
wave.
holding up a lighter.
Yeah, exactly. But I thought to myself, like, how cool is that for me to have been able to give them, that experience in that moment? Like, that's something that they're going to go talk to people about. I was in the park. I heard this thing. I saw it. It was going through the trees. What do you mean it was going through the trees? It was going through the trees, People who don't know anything about FPV, when they actually see it performed live, it really blows their minds. I mean, that's one thing that I find still really enjoyable. That's something that kind of gets my heart going if I know other people are watching it.
No, it is. It is. I remember when I first started, I was really good at faking it for 5 seconds, faking control for 5 seconds, and then became pretty apparent I didn't have control after the 5 seconds.
Right.
But there is something pretty magical about sharing it. So
yeah, absolutely.
It is good stuff. So. Well, man, I thank you for coming on. I really appreciate this. I really enjoyed it. It's occasionally, like, when you get down and deep and into like very specific things, like, you forget sometimes how nice it is to sort of get up to a meta level to think about that thing differently. And so, you definitely have allowed me to do that, and I greatly appreciate it. Now, we can cut this out if you don't want to talk about it, but you had mentioned maybe we could do a giveaway.
Oh yeah, definitely. We can do that.
You want to all right. So how do you want to run the giveaway?
I don't know. I guess I don't know how you want to do it. Like, comment, subscribe down below, and then pick some names out of the hat.
How about this? they will need to, because let's do this. Let's do it on, they can like if they want. You can't track that. So just like if you want or don't. I don't care.
Give them a like, guys.
Just give me the like.
You gotta like
okay?
it.
Give me the like. Leave a comment and give me your favorite color, because that means you got to the end. And then what we can do is then also please go, do you want them to sub to your YouTube channel, your Instagram, both?
Yeah, sure.
All right, go.
My YouTube doesn't have any I'm working on some content for the YouTube right now. But both of my handles are, they're VespulaFPV. Okay. So Instagram and YouTube.
So go give him some love, and then I guess we should maybe randomly pick we'll pick out of my comments. How's that?
Here's the thing is that I will, so what it is that I have download codes for Apple books. So it'll be the digital ebook version. Just so that people understand, it will only be compatible on an Apple device, unfortunately. Which I actually don't own Apple devices myself. I'm not a huge Apple fan, so it's not like I'm an Apple fanboy. It's just that with a book that's as graphically intensive as this, you have to understand that when you're converting it into a ebook, this has to be done in what's known as a fixed format layout. So basically, like what you see is what you get when it's not reflowable text or images. That particular file type is really only best read on Apple devices, like an iPad or a Mac.
Okay.
So I don't want anyone to get upset if they have a PCA and they win and they don't.
Hey,
they can't download it.
Winning is always great, regardless.
Right.
So, all right, and we'll figure out we're totally going into this half-hatched, but we'll make it work. We'll have some way of announcing it. We'll figure it out.
Okay, man.
Yeah. So, all right, man. By the way, my apologies. You had mentioned that, and I should have done.
Oh, no, I totally forgot about it too. So,
all right. Well, thank you, sir. It was really good having you. All of your contacts and everything will be in the description. So, ladies and gentlemen, you have been hanging out with the Michael Rollins Show with Christian Mollica, the author of FPV Flight Dynamics, which I can tell you is pretty fantastic. And I hope that you go check it out, give him some love, and we'll see y'all later. Bye.
Thanks, Mike.